Iran and Hezbollah working with the Kinahan cartel to smuggle cocaine into Europe. Protesters in Kenya being attacked by gangs hired by the government. All of that and much more on this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Welcome back to Organized Crime News Weekly. This is the weekly show where we discuss the goings-on in the global criminal underworld. Before I start, I just want to remind everyone to please like, share, and subscribe so we can help grow this channel. On June 25th, in Nairobi, Kenya, men armed with whips and clubs unleashed attacks on protesters who had gathered to commemorate the 60 people killed in the Gen Z uprising against tax increases which occurred last year. The main target of these protests was Kenyan President William Ruto, whose resignation the protesters demanded. 18 people were reportedly killed in this attack last week, with hundreds of others left seriously injured. As well as these casualties, the attackers torched and looted business premises, reportedly to portray the peaceful protesters as rioters and looters. This attack was not caught on camera due to the state banning live broadcast coverage of the protests. These attacks on protesters occurred just 1 week after these same group of criminals attacked protesters demanding the arrest of a police officer who was suspected of being involved in the death of a teacher and political blogger who had been in police custody. These armed goons are believed to have been hired by senior politicians and are believed to be members of various Nairobi criminal gangs such as the Congo Boys, the Gaza Gang, and the Kibera Battalion. These gangs have become useful for politicians and businessmen who often hire the gangs out as bodyguards during campaign rallies, intimidating voters and stuffing ballots, as well as assassinating political rivals and election officials. The number of gangs in Kenya in recent years has increased dramatically due to the country's high unemployment rate. It is said that 9 out of 10 gangs in Kenya are involved in politics and are funded by the politicians. The gang leaders are said to offer their members 2,000 Kenyan shillings, or just $15.50 each, to participate in these attacks, and they are also promised the opportunity to loot businesses. And this money contributes to the gang's coffers along with other activities such as extortion. Kenya is not the first country where politicians and businessmen have paid off gangsters to commit various acts of violence against political opponents. This is very common in other countries, particularly in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Haiti. Haiti in particular has seen a giant gang uprising in the last year, with many of these gangs purported to be backed by politicians and prominent businessmen. Ironically, Kenya has sent police officers over to Haiti for the past year to help combat the gangs when it turns out that they are in fact dealing with their own gang crisis. This story is a perfect example of how political institutions use gangsters to suppress democracy. These gangs obviously have no political ideology. They do everything for money, and the politicians are willing to look the other way in exchange for the gangs carrying out their dirty work. Going to Venezuela, a woman has been arrested for the murder of Venezuelan TikToker Gabriel Sarmiento in the Venezuelan state of Aragua. The shooting death of Sarmiento occurred on June 22nd in the middle of a live stream. The woman arrested for his murder has been identified as Purina Uribari and is said to be the partner of a gang member named Adrian Romero. She has been charged with intentional homicide, criminal association, and terrorism. Romero and 2 other men, Wilbert Gonzalez and Gerald Nieto, are currently wanted for the murder. Prior to his death, Gabriel Sarmiento had become prolific for denouncing gangs and police corruption on TikTok, where he had more than 77,000 followers. One of the gangs he denounced most prominently was Trende Aragua, who was the subject of the live stream during which he was killed. He would display pictures and videos of members of Trende Aragua during his live streams, as well as the names of corrupt police officers committing extortion. And Trende Aragua has become rather notorious over the last couple of years. They are mainly involved in sex trafficking and human trafficking, but also dabble in drug trafficking and extortion. They have spread all across Latin America and even into the United States, where U.S. politicians have made them into some sort of boogeyman, often labeling individuals as members of this gang with very little evidence. Just earlier this year, Trende Aragua was designated by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. But going back to Sarmiento's murder, since then there have been allegations that not just Trende Aragua, but also police officers were involved in the plot to kill him. However, Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello has denounced these speculations as being an opposition maneuver and that certain individuals are trying to discredit the government. Prende Aragua has been rumored to have ties to the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime has been said to have utilized criminal gangs to carry out acts of violence against who they perceive as political opponents. The Maduro regime is said to have sanctioned many of these gangs, like Prende Aragua, in return for a large portion of their profits, with the military and police said to be in on it and profiting greatly from this corruption. So Sarmiento seems to have angered not just the gangs, but also potentially the political establishment. It's doubtful that anyone will ever face any charges for his murder, considering protection the gangs are allowed in Venezuela. But this is another example of someone in an authoritarian country trying to speak out against what he saw as corruption and criminal activity. But since the Venezuelan state benefits from this criminal activity and directly participates in it, he was potentially viewed by some as a threat and therefore had to be taken out, unfortunately. Going to the U.S., 82-year-old Colombo crime family mobster Ralph DeLeo has been ordered to remain behind bars this past week after he was arrested last month for allegedly plotting the murder of 3 federal officials who were responsible for his convictions. Back in 2012, DeLeo was convicted of racketeering charges and sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was released on parole in May of 2024. DeLeo has a long criminal history going back to the 1970s when he was part of a crew that committed a string of armed robberies, which ultimately ended in him receiving a prison sentence of 25 to 40 years in 1976. However, he ended up escaping from custody and went on the run in Ohio, where he took part in the kidnapping of a bank manager, as well as a kidnapping for hire case, where he ended up murdering a prominent doctor. DeLeo was eventually recaptured and wasn't released again until 1997, and is said to have shortly thereafter become a made member of the Colombo crime family, one of the families that makes up the so-called 5 families of New York City's mafia. And eventually, around the year 2008, DeLeo rose up to become its street boss. This all despite the fact that he hails from Boston rather than New York City. After his release from prison last year, DeLeo had his house raided by the FBI, where they found the names and addresses of the officials responsible for his 2012 conviction, as well as items that included lifelike silicone masks, burglary kits, spy kits, and body cameras. Data obtained from his cell phone showed that he had made hundreds of searches for the officials' addresses and personal info. He has also been documented as stating that he wished to, quote, chop the heads off of the federal agents. This is a pretty shocking story, as you don't hear much about the current activities of the American Cosa Nostra, as they obviously have been on a rapid decline since the 1980s. DeLeo is planning to murder 3 federal agents at a time when the American mafia has been so defanged to the point where in 2025 they are mostly too afraid to carry out any sort of murder plot. But DeLeo obviously didn't seem to care and thought he could get away with his crime regardless of the intense scrutiny that is placed on the mafia by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. As I mentioned previously, DeLeo obviously had a very colorful criminal career going back to the 1970s, and this seems to be final chapter in that long career potentially, as he is 82 years old, and plotting the murder of 3 federal agents makes it pretty much assured that DeLeo will probably spend the rest of his life behind bars. 8 men were sentenced on July 4th for their roles in the largest drug seizure in Irish history. Back in September of 2023, Irish Army Rangers intercepted a cargo ship flying the Panamanian flag by the name of the MV Matthew off the coast of Cork, Ireland, and managed to seize approximately 2.2 tons of cocaine worth 152 million euros or $179 million. The MV Matthew had set sail from South America that previous August, where it collected the shipment of cocaine off the coast of Venezuela. The ship was due to rendezvous with a fishing trawler off the coast that would then transport the cocaine ashore. However, the fishing trawler ended up running up against a sandbar due to a storm, and Irish authorities then became suspicious of the MV Matthew. The MV Matthew attempted to flee Irish coasts, but it was ultimately boarded by the Irish Rangers, who discovered that some of the crew members were attempting to set some of the cocaine aflame in one of the lifeboats. The 8 men hail from various different countries, such as Ukraine, the Philippines, the Netherlands, and Iran, which is where the captain of the ship is from. They were all allegedly recruited by drug traffickers based out of Dubai, who recruited them through encrypted apps, and they have all been jailed for a combined sentence of 129 years after pleading guilty to charges last week in Ireland's Special Criminal Court. Each of them received a prison sentence of between 13 and 20 years. And now a little bit of background on the MV Matthew. Prior to August 2023, the MV Matthew sailed under the name of the MV Hanman and was owned by a Dubai-based company. Its name change came when it was bought by new owners of the company Matthew Maritime of the Marshall Islands. It is suspected that Matthew Maritime was nothing more than a shell company to hide the true identities of the owners of the ship, and it is now being said by Irish authorities that the true owners of the ship and the main culprits behind the failed cocaine shipment were the notorious Kinahan cartel based out of Dubai. I've mentioned the Kinahans many times on this show before. They are considered one of the most powerful cocaine trafficking organizations throughout the whole world. They make up one part of the so-called European super cartel, which is said to be responsible for a third of the cocaine being smuggled into Europe, and their notoriety and influence is so significant that in 2022, 3 leaders of the organization, Christy Kinahan and his sons Daniel and Christy Kinahan Jr., were sanctioned by the United States Treasury Department. The Kinahans are said to have invested 5 million euros or $5.9 million in the shipment, and part of the financing for this cocaine shipment is also said to have come from operatives working with Hezbollah out of Venezuela. And Hezbollah, for those who are unaware, is the Lebanese Shiite militant group that acts as a proxy for the Iranian regime in the region. They are said to also be heavily involved in drug trafficking and money laundering in order to finance their activities. The Kinahans are said to have become heavily affiliated with them in recent years, and that in turn has led them to become affiliated with the Iranian regime, which some say is part of the reason why they have been sanctioned, as the United States views Hezbollah as a terrorist organization working on Iran's behalf. And Iran, through its proxy Hezbollah, is said to be participating in these cocaine shipments with the Kinahans in order to put funds into the regime's coffers, as it continues to be heavily sanctioned by the United States and Europe, and also uses these funds to contribute to trying to spread its influence across the Middle East. And as I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, some of these Hezbollah operatives are said to be based out of Venezuela. The Venezuelan regime under Nicolas Maduro is said to have strong links to Iran and Hezbollah, and has provided a sanctuary for a lot of its members in the country. Nicolas Maduro and his regime are said to be heavily involved in cocaine trafficking, as they are also heavily sanctioned by the United States and European countries, and as well as taking some of this money for themselves. The Venezuelan regime needs these funds to prop up their regime. This is a story of huge international ramifications. Obviously, you got the powerful Kinahan cartel, which makes it interesting, but the fact that you have Iran and Hezbollah and potentially the Venezuelan regime all linked to this massive cocaine seizure in Ireland makes it much more significant. It goes to show how intertwined some of these authoritarian regimes are with organized crime, and how they often use criminal activities to prop up their regimes. And in return, they often provide groups such as the Kinahan cartel with protection should they ever need it. The Kinahan cartel is being heavily investigated by the authorities in Ireland, who are looking to extradite them back from Dubai to face criminal charges. Some say that if Dubai no longer is suitable for the Kinahans, they will try to flee to Iran, who will protect them due to their affiliations with each other in the cocaine trade. But the story of the Kinahans is yet to fully play out, and it remains to be seen if the Kinahans will ever face justice for their roles in the botched shipment of cocaine aboard the MV Matthew. All right, that's going to do it for this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back next week to report on more stories concerning the global criminal underworld. Thank you so much for tuning in.